They followed Iliki up a small river that joined with the Abelian after carving its way through the hills on its eastern flank. The bottom of its gully was wooded and steep, bringing them past many sets of tumbling rapids and stepstone falls. Florine scanned the surrounding vegetation, trying to get a sense of how far they had come. All she could discern, however, were all of the headless skeletons propped up against the trees to ward away intruders. "This is quite the distance," she said. "Why not relocate closer to the river?" It was what humans would have done, at least. The presence of infrastructure, industry, and resources determined how settlements were positioned. "Because it is not safe," Iliki replied. "Those who came before lived where we do for the same reason." They came to an escarpment that the Yoi were somehow scaling while carrying the massive beastmen corpses. Florine gazed up at the rainbow cast upon the spray of water overhead. "How are we going to get up?" In response to her question, Isoruku pointed a bony finger at her. "Fly." Florine froze as her soul eater lifted off of the ground, not daring to move until it alighted atop the escarpment. The vampire bride and Bubibi effortlessly climbed up after her. After that came several chains of Death Series servitors who clung to the legs of those above them as the one at the top lifted them into the air. She watched the undead sway back and forth in the wind as they took turns detaching from one another to land on the ground. "I don't think I've ever seen them do that before." "It is unwieldy," Isoroku said as it settled down beside her, "but the most efficient method in this situation." "Our home lies further," Iliki told them. "Come." 30 minutes later, they came to a steep bowl nestled between a set of hills. A large, spring-fed pool lay at the bottom, surrounded by a myriad of grottos pockmarking the slopes. "I can't tell whether these are natural or artificial," Florine said. "This was once the village of a Spriggan tribe," Iliki said. "It was they who shaped this place." The ground shuddered and the infantry squad closed in around Florine as a mound of liquid earth rolled by. Iliki quickly turned around, raising her cute little paws. "Please," she said, "do not cause trouble with the spirits. They will not attack if you do not harm this place." "What are they?" Florine asked. "Elemental spirits of Earth," Bubibi said. "Earth elementals. This location is a nexus of power. A place sacred to the elements that few would consider attacking." Another mound of earth rumbled by. Florine glanced over her shoulder at the scratching sound of Isoroku's pen. "Do the tribes of the Abelian Hills worship the four elements?" She turned her attention back to the earth elementals wandering around the slopes of the grotto. "Worship?" Bubibi twisted her long head slightly. "No. The elements are venerated amongst all the tribes, but not worshipped." She idly wondered how that compared to the worship of the four elemental gods. Then, another thought occurred to her. "Isoroku," she said, "have we documented the locations of these nexuses of power?" "No," the Elder Lich said. "Shall we call for survey teams to catalogue their locations?" "It may save time to just ask the tribes as we visit them," Florine said. "More importantly, do we have any way of protecting these locations?" "This is not impossible, but the Royal Army will require justification for the deployment of security forces." "That's because it was a resource. At least that was how outsiders would see it. The local tribes considered the location a sacred place, but potential travelers from the Holy Kingdom and other, more developed, realms would see it as a spot to capture Earth elementals. The Magician Guild offered high prices for them as they were essential for golem creation." "They may be targeted by poachers," Florine said. "Or you could say that they're citizens that need to be protected. These elementals aren't summons, they're intelligent beings that dwell in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. In that case, targeting the elementals for capture could be considered raiding for the purpose of taking slaves." Could they be classified in that fashion? The problem brought her recent discussion with Ludmilla to mind. While intelligent, elementals were beings with values and behaviors alien to those raised in human civilization. They wouldn't pay taxes nor participate in industry and had no use for money. They would attack perceived threats to their territory. As far as Florine knew, they contributed nothing to a nation's economy unless they were captured and used. They simply existed. "Iliki," Florine said, "do you do anything special here?" "Special? This is where we were told to dwell. Were we expected to do more?" "I was just curious. Bubibi mentioned that the tribes considered places like this sacred, so I thought it might have some special activities." Iliki looked around the spring. Hundreds of Yoi were eyeing them warily from the entrances of their new dens. "It is a sacred place even if no one dwelled here," Iliki said. "Nothing special must be done to make it so. I do not understand what you are trying to say." "I believe that humans construct their sacred places," Bubibi said. "At least that is what I saw in the Holy Kingdom of Roble. The humans gather in those places to venerate the elements." The Yoi shook her head unknowingly. Florine cleared her throat. "We can take our time learning about one another," she said. "That's part of why I'm here, after all. Let's move on to more mundane things, shall we? Do you have a family?" Iliki turned around, leading them along one side of the spring. She stopped in front of a grotto not dissimilar to the others. 9 adult Yoi poked their heads out of the entrance and 12 smaller heads poked out between them. Their glistening noses twitched in Florine's direction. "This is my family," Iliki told her. "It's so large," Florine said. "Are all Yoi families like this?" "Yes." "Which one is your husband?" Iliki stood up on her hind legs, waddling over to the group. "This one," she pointed a claw, "this one, this one, this one and this one." "Ah, mother, I've found the woman you wanted me to be." "Who are the other adults?" Florine asked. "They are the mates of my mates." "Huh? Then, what about the children?" Iliki's nose twitched in the direction of the group. The long pause made Florine suspect that she was trying to decide. "These 3, Iliki pointed at a cluster of heads. "And who are their fathers?" "The fathers are my mates, here," Iliki gestured to the adults she had pointed out before. "Could you be more specific?" "No." Florine rubbed her right temple with her fingers. "Is something the matter?" Iliki asked. "Just something I hadn't considered before," Florine answered. "Please don't mind me." She wasn't sure if it was that big of a deal or not, but it seemed that way. The Sorceress Kingdom adopted Riastai's law, and Riastai's operated under human logic and customs. One of the major cornerstones of those laws was the concept of inheritance and how it was determined. Whether it was a contract of vassalage, the ownership of a business, or the assumption of debt, the law assumed that the people involved followed human conventions of family. With the Yoi, one could not apply laws of inheritance because lines of inheritance could not be drawn. At best, they could be drawn between groups of offspring, and those offspring would likely mature to go their separate ways and form new family groups, making it impossible to keep track of anything. Florine tried to imagine what would happen if a family of Yoi moved to a territory in Irantal. Any noble who signed a tenant contract with them had no idea of the chaos that awaited. Integration wasn't possible. The concepts that the law was founded on were fundamentally incompatible with the race in question. By now, the Sorceress Kingdom's lawmakers had a sense that the law needed to change if the country was to be a place where many races lived together in harmony, but the realities that came with those changes still hadn't sunk in with most. When she worked with the tribes north of Irantal, Florine was focused on how they could participate in the Sorceress Kingdom's economy. She was so pleased with her progress in that area that she didn't think about how everything else might work or how her influence might affect the other aspects of the participants' societies. Perhaps it had something to do with her job classes generating a bias towards certain things, but she had to think carefully about what she did now that she was directly tasked with the management of the Abelian wilderness. "By the way," Florine said, "does this tribe have a lord?" Going by how Ludmilla did things, it was easier to deal directly with lords. Every lord seemed to have a good understanding of the things that she needed to address. The lords, in turn, acted as a sort of translator when it came to bridging racial and cultural differences, as well as identifying various problems and figuring out solutions for them. "She was slain by Yaldabaoth not long after our tribe was captured," Iliki replied. "No new lord has risen since." "Then what prompted you to speak for your tribe?" Florine asked. "No one else wanted to?" Iliki answered, "It did not seem that we would be able to eat until someone answered your call, so I decided to come forward." "Does that mean that she has the makings of a lord?" She wasn't sure how it worked. For some races, lords were born, but, for most, it was a seemingly mystical process. Ludmilla had successfully trained one, but how did they occur normally? Did they become lords because they did something extraordinary? "This might sound like a strange question," Florine said, "but do tribes usually have a lord?" "That depends," Bubibi said. We do not encounter the lords of other tribes until they have become fully fledged lords. Some lords, like those of the Xian, are kept safely away from danger at all times. At the least, I know that goblin and ogre tribes do not usually have lords, nor do most demi-humans and heteromorphs that lead solitary lives. Humans are strange in the fact that they seem to have lords on hand nearly at all times, and most of those lords appear to be very weak. Florine turned her attention to Iliki. I am not old, the Yoi said. I have only known one lord of my tribe. Do you know anyone that might remember other lords? Iliki shook her head. Yaldabaoth slew the strong and the old. Or perhaps they were strong because they lived long lives? Either way, no memory remains beyond that of my generation and what our elders shared with us. This is consistent with the way Yaldabaoth did things, Boobibi said. The old and experienced were tortured and killed. Only the young tended to remain, those easily manipulated by the machinations of the fiends. I suggest that you be wary of this. Wary in what way? Are you saying that Yaldabaoth and his minions might have conditioned problematic behaviors into the remaining tribal populations? That may be true, as well, Boobibi said after a long pause. It does seem like something that Yaldabaoth would do, leaving scars behind as a lasting legacy of his actions. What I was referring to, however, was the fact that the young are often impulsive and lack the experience and wisdom of their elders. Speaking of which, how old are you? It is difficult for me to tell with humans. I would be considered a young adult by my culture's standards, Florine replied. Truly? The Xian hero's voice rose in surprise. I thought the Sorceress Kingdom would have sent someone older for this task. Florine tried to imagine what Countess Jesn would do in her position. Nope, that wouldn't work at all. Our elders come from the country that the Sorceress Kingdom won its land from, Florine said. They are undoubtedly more experienced in the ways of that old country, but the Sorceress Kingdom is far from the same. In a way, I am much like the people here when it comes to being the first generation needing to adapt to the new way of things. Perhaps that is part of the reason why I was sent. I suppose that makes sense, in a way, Boobibi said. But what it is that you are trying to do still eludes me. The end objectives are clear enough, Florine replied. My task is to figure out how to incorporate the population of the Abelian wilderness into the Sorceress Kingdom and turn them into productive citizens, if possible. Doing so with so many different races and cultures is easier said than done, however. That much, I can believe. We were allies of the humans in the Holy Kingdom against Yaldabaoth, but I don't believe we ever developed an understanding of them. The only race in the Abelian Hills that could be found cooperating under many other races were goblins, but I have not seen a single one since the region was liberated. My materials mentioned that, but I couldn't quite believe it myself. The last place where I worked, goblins were everywhere. Remarking on it didn't help, however. She had to work with what she had. After spending all morning and most of the afternoon with the Yoi, Florine felt that she had a much better grasp of the mostly cute demi-human race and its customs. If what she had learned so far was any indication, every race in the area would add another layer of complexity to her task. Before she departed, a quick review of her notes reminded her to ask about something. Iliki, she said, are there any amongst your people who would be interested in becoming travelers? In the Sorceress Kingdom, there would be no need to mark any candidates as such to protect your tribe from any retribution for their actions. Preferably, I would like anyone who is curious about the world and can also share the ways of their people with others. The human-sized rodent demi-human seemed to consider her request. No, she said after a moment. There would be no one that matches your requirements. Our people have no reason to stray from their homes, and the world around us is filled with danger. If you must take someone, however, I will come. You don't have to force yourself to come. Iliki looked over her shoulder, to the grottos where her people had long returned to their usual routines. I have no choice, she said. It is our way. In stepping forward when you first called out, I have become recognized as the bait that draws danger away. That's terrible. Is it? The Yoi asked. How would it be with humans? Florine fell silent, a furrow forming on her brow. If that same scenario was applied to a human by their community, it would either be considered a heroic act of self-sacrifice or a stupid one. And then there were the people who would order or fool others into doing so for their selfish ends. Forgive me, Florine lowered her head. I suppose that an action taken for the greater good of one's tribe shouldn't be seen as something terrible. You'll have to bear with me while I become familiar with your people and their ways. Will your children be all right without you? Just to be sure, Iliki said, I am not going to be eaten or turned into one of the undead, am I? Of course not, Florine smiled. By coming with me, you will be performing a great service for your people. Hopefully, your safe return and the benefits that your travels bring to your tribe will encourage others to travel, as well. In that case, the children will be fine. Caring for one's young is a task divided between all members of a den. I see. Well, if you need to return for any reason, just let me know. We will be traveling all over the place, but nothing should be farther than a day or so from your home by Solita. We'll be providing food, so please only pack what you'll need aside from that. Pack? Any belongings you'd like to bring with you while we travel? Florine eyed Iliki up and down. She wasn't wearing anything whatsoever. The only members of her tribe that did seem to be the mystics who wore colorful accessories that mostly consisted of unprocessed items such as flowers and feathers. Can you think of anything that you need to take with you? Florine asked. Nothing in particular, Iliki replied. She couldn't imagine not taking anything with her while going anywhere, even if it was just a stroll around Rantle. While the Yoi had their furry coats, Florine couldn't imagine why they wouldn't carry containers or belts for holding everyday items. In that case, she said, let's get going. You'll at least tell your family that you're coming with me, right? Of course. Florine waited while Iliki disappeared into her den. When she emerged again, the heads of her family poked out of the entrance to watch her leave. Florine couldn't tell whether they were sad, anxious, or simply curious. They departed the grotto, walking back down to the Abelian River. From there, they followed the river downstream to the Dale of Defiance so Florine could update the administration's information on the Yoi. Iliki seemed to grow nervous as they approached the bend in the river where the office was located. Is something the matter, Iliki? Florine asked. When we were in captivity, Iliki replied, some of the other prisoners said that the Dale of Defiance was where Yaldabaoth first fell upon the hills. For some reason, Florine said, everyone that I've spoken to so far seems to recognize this location by that name. Why is that? Because it is where a legend known by all took place, Boo-Bibi told her. Where the mighty heroes of old came together to defeat the demon god king and his remaining followers. Of course, a battle of that magnitude would have spanned many dozens of kilometers, but the Dale of Defiance is where the heroes made their stand before the fighting commenced, and it is where the demon god king fell. Yaldabaoth fell upon us here as if despite the achievements of the past. Florine looked across the shallow crater as they crossed the first security perimeter. If so many different tribes of different races and cultures of the Abelian Hills shared that common point of law, then there was a good chance that it was true. How did everyone find out that Yaldabaoth first appeared here? Florine asked. Did the tribe that once lived here spread the word? No, Boo-Bibi said. No tribe dwelled in the Dale of Defiance. It is a special place where everyone respects the fact that the many races of the Abelian Hills and beyond came together to destroy a great threat to the world. Out of that respect, no one claims this place as their territory, nor does anyone bring their conflicts here. Yaldabaoth fell upon a great celebration held in midwinter to commemorate the victory over the demon gods. Florine froze in her steps just before she entered the main pavilion. Wait, she said, are you saying that something like a festival is held here every winter? One that every race in the Abelian Hills attends? It wasn't held last year for obvious reasons, but yes. Why didn't you say so earlier? Her steps resumed, carrying her straight to her desk. It was mostly her fault. The accounts of Yaldabaoth's reign of terror was so atrocious that she wanted to hear as little about it as possible. What she had heard was already enough to give her a lifetime of nightmares. Florine produced a pen and snatched a fresh sheet of paper. I can use this, probably. A common point across cultures that everyone respected. One that even had a communal ritual observed by every race. All she needed to figure out was how to not offend everyone or trample on existing traditions while making use of it. Once she scribbled down her thoughts, she returned outside. Boo-Bibi, Iliki, and Leolio were gathered in the shadow of the tent. Sorry for the wait, Florine said. Iliki, do you have any special requirements for accommodations? This is the main offer, the place where I return to after going out to meet the various tribes. We return here to sleep, when possible, at least those of us who need to sleep. The Yeoi's head swiveled back and forth as she scanned the surroundings. I can dig a new tunnel, she said. Where may I do this? Have you considered something like a tent? Florine gestured to one of the tents nearby. In response, Iliki went over to inspect the tent. A minute later, sprays of dirt erupted from the entrance. That's not what I meant. The scene reminded her of when the Quagoa first arrived in Iranthal. They had prepared houses for the new arrivals, but the Quagoa immediately started digging a tunnel to hide in. Even after they figured out what was going on, the Quagoa refused their new homes in favor of tunneling out living spaces under Iranthal. Since the Yoi didn't appear to suffer from day blindness, Florine thought that things might be different. Apparently not. A pair of patrolling Death Knights stopped in front of the tent, eyeing the activity curiously. Florine waved them away, letting them know that everything was all right. Boo-bee-bee, she said, would the remaining races in the Abelian Hills still respect their customs surrounding the Dale of Defiance? I am not certain, Boo-bee-bee replied. Before, it was a custom that celebrated the triumph of the tribes and the unity of the heroes of old. Now, it may only be a bitter reminder of Yaldabaoth's reign. Florine feared that it might be the case. Bad things always tended to rise to the forefront of memory. Once again, Yaldabaoth played true to his fiendish nature. He may have wrought physical ruin to a catastrophic degree, but that was secondary to the lasting, intangible damage that his actions caused. Hearts and minds were broken, traditions and values that might be considered good were drowned in a flood of suffering and tragedy. Her first thought was to take advantage of the old custom to bring people together. At the same time, she could open a simple market to promote trade within the Abelian Hills. The market would serve various purposes, including helping to identify valuable resources, seeing how the new subjects could fit into the greater economy of the Sorceress Kingdom, facilitating the exchange of ideas and giving rise to the beginnings of a collective regional culture. Trade was a worldwide activity, one that was engaged in by more races, countries, and cultures than she could name. She had no reason to believe that it couldn't be encouraged in the Abelian Hills for its beneficial effects. Due to Yaldabaoth, however, Florine was sensitive to the possibility that opening something like a market might be perceived as shameless exploitation. Did the tribes participate in trade during this celebration that you spoke of? She asked. Yes, Boo-bee-bee replied. The Dark Dwarves would put up a tent where they displayed their merchandise and exchanged goods with the local tribes. Ugh. The fact that things would have probably gone smoothly since the tribes would recognize what she was doing made Yaldabaoth's actions hurt all the more. Now she was being foiled by his machinations and he likely didn't even know that she existed. Those old tales about the far-reaching evil of fiends have nothing on the real thing. Florine still believed that her idea would work, however. She would just have to be very careful about how she laid out her plans. Are you mocking us, girl? I assure you that my request is entirely genuine, Master Falagrim. This damn human. She was undoubtedly mocking them. Just before dawn, Falagrim's Deep Wardens reported that the undead were sweeping the area around his camp, or at least where they thought the camp was, presumably in an effort to find them. Given the generally poor scouting skills that the undead possessed, that would likely never happen, so Falagrim came out to see what they wanted. What he got was a slap in the face. We're not interested in participating in a market with no profit, he told the human from the Sorceress Kingdom. But you can profit in this market, the human insisted. The quality of your craftsmanship is renowned amongst the tribes and you will not lack for customers. There's no profit to be had so long as you don't allow us to take slaves as payment. Similarly, your gold means nothing if it can't be used to purchase slaves. You seem to value things other than slaves. The provisions we just delivered, for instance. While we're up here, sure, but our people are entirely self-sufficient. We have absolutely no need for food imports. My mountain dwarf acquaintances clearly appreciate the quality of the Sorceress Kingdom's food exports. They also prize our liquor. Falagrim spat to the side in disgust at her characteristically bigoted statement. Dark dwarves aren't mountain dwarves, if you hadn't noticed. We don't drink. We could care less about your food quality. A bit of bread is all we need. By bread, do you happen to mean dwarven bread? He pulled out a chunk of bread from a belt pouch, slapping it onto the boulder between them. The girl started as the boulder shattered. Falagrim sneered at her display of frailty. What else would I be talking about? He stuffed the bread back into its pouch. Now, unless you're willing to allow us to exchange our goods for slaves, we have nothing more to discuss. In that case, what about using the undead as security forces? Surely your people have their fair share of dangers to address? We address those dangers ourselves. Didn't I already say something about how foolish it is to use other people's undead for labor? What makes you think using them for security is any better? No matter how cheap you make them, the fact that they're ultimately under someone else's control is a deal breaker. The damn girl kept bringing her undead up as if his answer would somehow change. It is unfortunate that we couldn't come to a mutually beneficial understanding, the human said. But you and your company are always welcome to participate in our markets, should you change your mind. The sun would rise underground, first. With nothing more to say, Falagrim and his escort turned and left the undead checkpoint, taking a roundabout route back to his concealed camp. The air shimmered as he crossed the threshold and he made his way to the central campfire where two grey robes awaited. We ready to go? Falagrim said. The preparations are ready, my prince. He followed the pair to a rocky outcropping jutting out from the valley slope. Agni and several merchants were gathered at its base. Falagrim eyed the baggage at the cleric's feet. Staying for a while? He asked. Since we're stalled here, it's a good opportunity to take care of a few additional things. The appearance of this sorceress kingdom is concerning. We all saw how powerful Yaldabaoth and his minions were. I should see if there's any mention of them in the histories and consult with the temples. Falagrim grunted in agreement. Given what they had seen, it was evident that the demon emperor had been replaced by something far worse. What about that human noble necromancer merchant or whatever she is? She seems young, naive, and idealistic in the most foolish ways possible. Such individuals are easily manipulated. That's not what I was talking about. Agni bent over and picked up the bags against her feet. An offshoot, maybe, she said. Or a forgotten remnant. A lot of things would make sense if she's an imperial arcanist. They can be everything she's shown herself to be. So nothing like a resurgence or a distant colony returning to restore their homeland? I doubt it, Agni said. If it was anything as substantial as that, they would have wasted no time pulling everything back together again. It's clear that no one in the region has inherited the strength and order of the old empire. Then what about that Superlich idea? The cleric shrugged. That was based on a rumor. We haven't seen anything directly out of her to suggest that it's true. My best guess is that she's working for someone and the undead have been instructed to follow her commands. It's in line with how she refers to the undead and keeps trying to convince us to lease them. Falagrim wondered which one was worse, the return of those insufferable Archelians or the undead setting up shop nearby. He took one last look around before the grey cloaks completed their ritual and he stepped into the escarpment. Frigid winds greeted him as he stepped out into a high mountain valley. His attention instantly went to the towering cliff behind him. Nothing could be seen, but he knew that it was there. The cliff itself was the Gate of Harda, the main entrance to the dwarven principalities of Karsanar. Fashioned by the greatest artisans of its time, the portal was indistinguishable from the landscape around it and no clue of its existence lingered on the surface. Even the area where they stood was proofed against observation from sources both mystic and mundane. Well, Agni shifted the weight of the baggage over her shoulders. I'll be off, then. With that, the cleric disappeared into the stone. As the only one in Falagrim's company that wasn't in exile, she was the sole individual who could do so. Falagrim crossed his arms and leaned against the cliff, waiting for one of his contacts to come out. Though there was no sign or sense that they were being observed, there was also no doubt that they were. 2 hours later, a severely dressed dwarf came out with a small cadre of guards in adamantite plates so heavily enchanted that they seemed to pulse with dark light. The thick adamantite rings clinching the braids in their beards clinked against one another as they approached. Earlier than expected, the newcomer said. Come to drop off Aunt Agni? Something like that, Falagrim replied. War's winding down. I can't get a refund for that equipment, father. You don't have to tell me that, boy. Then I'll have our suppliers switch production, as usual. Let your mother handle that. His son's beard shifted as his ever-present frown deepened. Falagrim sent a pointed look at her gate of harder. Right, his son said. They parted with a grunt and a shared nod. Unlike with most races, trust was no measure of security when it came to information. Dark dwarves were a psionically gifted race, and a young dwarf could easily have any fresh information or active thoughts ripped from their minds by passers-by. Agony didn't accompany Falagrim just because they needed a company cleric or to represent his wife's interests. She was also strong enough to resist any psychic incursion that their enemies could bring to bear, making her ideal for delivering information between them. It was the best way to stay competitive. With any further actions hinging on his wife's reply, he settled in for a long wait, leaning against the stone that refused to let him back into his home. The crunch of iron-shod boots echoed through the darkened halls below the gate of Harder. A figure cloaked in grey tones rushed forward, the sound of her ragged breath mixing with those of her desperate steps. Her pained cry pierced the air as a black iron quarrel sprouted from her thigh. The figure fell forward, rolling twice before settling into a moaning heap. A column of armored dwarves emerged from the same passage as the fleeing woman. The one at its head stepped up and stomped a boot directly onto the quarrel. An agonized cry echoed down the surrounding tunnels. No! The woman gasped desperately. Please! Agni smiled as her flanged mace split the woman's skull open. A swift kick sent the dead dwarf's body rolling into the flooded gutter nearby. The murky waters churned as the vile things that lived beneath its surface tore the corpse apart. She sent a look around the corridor. The dozens of witnesses averted their gazes, returning to whatever they were doing. No one in their right mind would raise a hand to help a corpse or even suggest that someone had been killed. There was simply no gain in doing so, and, in doing so, they had everything to lose. I don't think she learned anything. That doesn't matter, Uldan, Agni said. She tried, so she died. The fact that she did was a bad sign in itself. Certainly, heedless fools existed, but to try skimming thoughts from a member of the great clans was normally unthinkable. Agni turned and walked back through their escort, continuing her journey deep into Khazanah. She tasted the thoughts of those who dared to meet her gaze as she passed them, sensitive for any traces of antipathy or contempt. Have the other clans been up to anything new since the last time I came around? She asked. Not that I know of, Uldan answered. There has been no sign of change, not in the machinations of the realm, nor the minds of the people. What about the markets? Well, I suppose there's that. Everyone's becoming more liberal with their slaves considering the hauls that father's been bringing in. Productivity's gone up threefold. We've even had some undead popping up in the mines. Agni nodded. The appearance of the undead was a sign that no effort was being spared by the handlers to maximize the output of their slaves. It was a good thing, but all good things came to an end. With the Sorceress Kingdom's economic embargo in place, the pendulum would soon swing to the opposite side. A blast of humid air buffeted them as they crossed over the first of Khazanah's 5 great chasms. The ancient stone bridge that spanned it led them to Fielhammer Citadel, the great hold of Clan Fielhammer which loomed over the teeming slave markets and the swathe of slums lining the unfathomably deep void. Another escort awaited them at the entrance to the hold. There, Uldan parted ways with Agni. She was led up the steps chiseled into the side of the colossal stalactite out of which the citadel was fashioned. Their ascent spiraled into ever-widening circles, taking them up 200 meters to the citadel's main gate. The portal of enchanted adamantite alloy swung open, absent of any fanfare or even recognition of its rare guest. The graven figures of her ancestors cast their grim gazes down upon her as she traversed the entry hall. She turned down a side corridor and several pairs of the house guards stepped aside as she made her way closer to its sole source of light. Agni squinted as she entered an office flooded with the illumination of indigo dark lamps. You've returned. Agni walked up a long, crimson carpet woven from the beards of hundreds of fire giants, genuflecting before the obsidian desk at its opposite end. A dull boom echoed around the chamber as the guards shut the doors. Sister, she said, it's been a while. You encountered a worm, Ba'awin said. That we did, Agni replied. The question is why? You have a spy in the company, her sister said. Several, probably. There are always spies in the company, Agni rolled her eyes. Why do random peasants suddenly dare to skim the minds of our scions? I was hoping you could shed some light on that. Agni sighed and stood again, walking forward to take a seat on one of the granite stools in front of the desk. She removed her helm and set it down on the corner of the desk. Across from her, the figure of her sister shimmered with the intensity of her defensive enchantments. Even protected thusly and surrounded by her house guard, assassination attempts were a regular occurrence. Yaldabaoth's war with the Holy Kingdom of Roble is over, Agni said. I would have thought that the Demon Emperor would take more time savoring their struggles, her sister frowned. So this war is over. When is the next? And where? Ivasha? Slain? The pitiful remnants of the Empire across the north? None, I reckon. Yaldabaoth was not the victor in Roble. Ba'awin snorted. Do you mean to say that those humans somehow won against an archfiend and his fiendish legions plus the tribes of the Abelian Hills? The world can be a strange place, sister, but there are limits. There was an interloper in the conflict. A country that refers to itself as the Sorceress Kingdom. Her sister fell silent, crossing her arms with an especially grim expression. It wasn't hard to imagine why. Yaldabaoth's invasion barely required any effort on the archfiend's part. Any interlopers that appeared would have to be as strong as he was. They're in the process of solidifying their hold on the Abelian Hills, Agni continued. If their representative is to be believed, they entered the conflict on the side of Roble. What's the point of that? Ba'awin asked. Any power that could defeat Yaldabaoth would make toys out of Roble's humans. The same can be said for the tribes of the Abelian Hills. Solidifying their hold on the region is absolutely unnecessary. Their time would be better spent figuring out how to deal with that spoiled brat in Ivasha or Slane's divine legacy. Ba'awin was, of course, correct. The might that could be brought to bear by the powers in the south made those in the north seem laughably harmless by comparison. Any effort expended in the north could only be considered playing around. I don't know what the ultimate purpose of what they're doing is, Agni said. I can only report what we've seen and what they claim to be up to. And what might that be? Imposing a new order. They've also asked us to trade with them, but they've outlawed slavery. We can't even transport slaves through their territory as they would consider them contraband. What did Falagrim say? He tried to press our case, but the representative wouldn't budge. We will no longer be able to import slaves from the realms above, at least not through the gate of Harda. They care not for our ways, yet they invite us to partake of their own. It was one thing to invite others to participate in their customs, but it was another to trample on the customs of those that they invited in the process. At best, it might be considered a sort of arrogance founded in ignorance. At worst, it was an insult. Either way, few races that were genuinely interested in diplomacy or trade would do such a thing. What is the predominant race in this sorcerer's kingdom? Ba'awin asked. We're not sure about that, Agni answered. The representative that we interacted with was a human girl. She came prepared with everything needed to deal with dark dwarves, so there are still many mysteries about this new power. So was this impression due to it being conveyed by a human? That's difficult to tell. She's young, but her ability is undeniable. She manhandled our merchants and Falagrim couldn't get through to her. There's a strong possibility that she's also a magic caster. An Imperial Arcanist? We considered that, Agni said. Ultimately, we don't have enough information. Another possibility I am looking into is that she is in the service of a powerful undead caster, an evolved lich of some sort. The military forces of the Sorcerer's Kingdom appear to consist entirely of the undead, and the representative was attempting to promote the use of undead labor to us. No wonder they outlawed slavery. It's a reasonable assumption. One less source of competition. Ba'awin uncrossed her arms and reached for a sheet of parchment. What are we going to do? Agni asked. We're in no position to challenge this Sorceress Kingdom, Ba'awin said. But losing the surface trade puts the clan in a difficult position. Have we made any gains using Yaldabaoth's business? I expected it to go on for much longer, as did the other clans. You mean to say they've been dancing around our overtures, Agni said, and you've been humoring them thinking that we had more time. In truth, it was to be expected. A menace of Yaldabaoth's scale would be expected to last for many years, if not decades. Considering the way that he seemed to operate, the Dragon Lords would not directly act against him, so everyone felt that they would have a long, lucrative relationship with the Demon Emperor. If only our dear prince hadn't spurned your overtures? Ba'awin's lip turned up in a smirk. I still don't think I'm wrong, Agni muttered. With our situation as it is, we need a backup plan. You should know the dangers by now, her sister told her. The other clans are not as blind as you once believed them to be. What could they even do? None would leave Khazanah to interfere with us, and none would risk themselves attacking the citadel. They would weaken themselves to the extent that they would be set upon by the others. You're not wrong, Ba'awin replied. But the appearance of this sorceress kingdom changes things. Nothing has broken our status quo before. Our people have suddenly found themselves on the precipice of chaos. The matron of Clan Feelhammer folded the parchment and slid it across the desk. Agni's eyes narrowed as she read over her instructions. Falagrim's going to be spitting acid over this, she said. Ba'awin snorted. He'll live. On the bright side, you finally get to try what you've always wanted. Agni slid off of her seat, stuffing her sister's missive in a pocket under her armor. Ba'awin returned her attention to her work. And what will you do here, sister? Agni asked. The other clans have the initiative here, Ba'awin answered. All we can do is keep an ear open to any whispers and prepare our defenses for what may come. Back outside the citadel, Agni found a different set of guards waiting for her. Of course, her sister's instructions meant that she couldn't conduct any research on the Sorceress Kingdom lest her activities give away more than they intended. The armored escort led her back down to the main level where yet another set of guards awaited alongside carts loaded with cages. Each contained a dark dwarf, garbed in shoddy rags, their faces tattooed with marks of exile. Passers-by turned their gazes away from the disgraced prisoners, though many took the time to hurl stones and insults in their direction before doing that. Let's move, Agni said. I don't want to waste any more mana on healing than necessary. The carts rumbled forward, forming a long line as they crossed the chasm on their way to the gate of Harda. They stopped just inside the gate, where the cages were emptied and the prisoners shoved through the stone. Agni squinted in annoyance as she stepped out into the early morning light, nearly tripping over an exile who had lost his footing in the brightness. I didn't expect you until tonight, Falagrim's voice came out from the shadows along the cliff face. What the hell is all of this? Let's get out of this blasted daylight first, Agni growled. She sighed in relief as the grey robes transported them through the stone and back into the shadows of their camp in the Abelian hills. The prisoners gaped up with uncertain expressions at the unfamiliar surroundings. Several deep wardens came forward to beat them into line. Hold, Agni said as they raised their whips. They're ours. The prisoners lined themselves up before Falagrim, lowering themselves to a knee before their prince. Each one was an agent of Clan Feelhammer assigned to support the company in their new task. Falagrim looked down at the agents, his hands on his hips. Can someone tell me what's going on now? In response, Agni produced Ba'awin's missive, holding it out toward Falagrim. The Dwarf Lord's expression grew dark as his eyes went back and forth over the page. You've got to be kidding me. Our patrols are still unable to locate the Dark Dwarven camp, the army liaison said. But didn't you say you know the general location where they disappeared? Florine asked. That is correct, the Elder Lich answered. We suspect that magic or some special ability is being employed to prevent us from discovering the camp's location. Aren't the undead supposed to be immune to that sort of magic? The undead are immune to mind-affecting spells and abilities, but not all spells and abilities that foil detection and perception fall into that category. This includes many illusion spells, camouflage, and effects that influence navigation and terrain. Even when the infantry patrols walked into the locations where the dark dwarves seemed to vanish, they only found themselves in an empty span of forest. The idea that spells and abilities could be so effective that they could do that was vexing, to say the least. Magic and special abilities were common elements in popular tales, but they were rarely so mysterious and the protagonists always had some trick to beat them. Is there any way we can overcome this? Florine asked. Not within the bounds of your stated parameters, the Elder Lich answered. Since things didn't seem like they were going too well with the Dark Dwarves, Florine didn't want to make things worse by appearing too intrusive. That limited her options to having patrol routes take them through areas where the Dark Dwarves were suspected to reside. Unfortunately, whatever they were doing was above any chance for casual discovery. How strong are these Dark Dwarves, exactly? Isoroku's assessment of the Falagrim's party as members of a Type A human civilization suggested that they shouldn't have been much different than a group from Riastais or Baharuth. How easily they were eluding detection with an entire merchant company, however, suggested otherwise. Not even the Zia know where the dark dwarves reside, Bubibi said. They seem to show up at will wherever they wish and vanish just as easily. Only two are strong, Leolia piped up. The dwarf lord and his female. Wait, Florine frowned. How can you recognize Falagrim as a dwarf lord but not me as a human lord? A lord is a lord, the Miku replied matter-of-factly. Florine held in a sigh, turning her attention back to the first of the new merchant stands she was setting up. It wasn't very complicated, consisting of a small striped tent with a single long table in front of it. She had ordered a few things delivered from Erantal since she decided to create a market in the Dale of Defiance, but working with what she had in the meanwhile helped her to think about what else needed to be done. It didn't need to be very complicated, really. All she wanted was for the different tribes to peaceably interact and develop an appreciation for what they had to offer to one another. Except that was far more complicated than it seemed. She had to keep in mind all of the different races and their potential interactions, and she had no idea what made things work before. Additionally, there were any number of harmful things that might be promoted and the new citizens weren't well versed in the Sorceress Kingdom's laws. For the time being, Florine asked the undead security forces to be considerate of the growing pains that were sure to accompany their work, but she wasn't sure whether they understood what she was asking. She had a feeling that her life for the next few months would be filled with running around putting out fires as she mediated all of the differences and misunderstandings that cropped up. I need help. She couldn't train that help until she could codify how that help needed to operate, however. All she could do for now was work everything out as she went. Lady Gonye, the army liaison said. The dark dwarves have re-emerged. They are requesting an audience. Ah, really? It is highly doubtful that the sergeant has misinterpreted their intent. I didn't mean to cast doubt on the report, Florine said. I was just surprised, that's all. Where are they? At the checkpoint in the northern quadrant of the second security perimeter. Florine set her things aside, quickly checking over her appearance before mounting her Solita and riding to the northern checkpoint. There, she found Falagrim with a much larger following than before. The dwarf lord stepped forward as she dismounted, his thumbs hooked into his belt. We'll try things your way, he said. Where do you want us to set up?